Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today I want to take you to the beginning of the spring campaign of 1864 in Virginia, better known as the Overland Campaign. The Union Army of the Potomac going up against the Army of Northern Virginia one more time. And this time was slightly different in that the Army of the Potomac had the man pictured here with it, Ulysses Simpson Grant. Grant and his staff made their headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, which was technically commanded by Major General George Gordon Meade. However, Grant was pretty much calling the shots through the spring and summer and into the fall, and finally at Appomattox. But in this spring of 1864, with Grant being relatively new to the East, the Army of Northern Virginia really didn't quite know what Grant was capable of. In fact, very few people actually knew of him. One of Robert E. Lee's subordinates, Brigadier General Evander M. was quite surprised about how little his peers and his superiors knew about Grant. Even the officers from what Law called the Old Army, that's the pre war U.S. Army, that solid group of West Pointers who had been through so much together, even they had little to say about Grant's past. But everyone did know about Grant's campaigns in 1861 and 1862 and 1863, and they were, well, generally unimpressed, according to Law. Law shared his recollections about how Lee's army viewed Grant in an article he wrote in 1884, 20 years after the Overland campaign. The article is titled From the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, and it appeared in the Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series published by the Century magazine. I want to read to you Law's own words about the views of Grant. I think it's really interesting to get a sense of what they thought Grant was all about and how they critiqued his performance. So here we go. This is Brigadier General Evander Law. Quote, when General Grant was appointed to the command of the Union armies and established his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, we, of the Army of Northern Virginia, knew very little about his character and capacity as a commander. Even old Army officers who were supposed to know all about anyone who had ever been in the Army before the war seemed to know as little as anybody else. The opinion was pretty freely expressed, however, that Grant's, Western laurels would wither in the climate of Virginia. His name was associated with Shiloh, where it was believed that he had been outgeneraled and badly beaten by Albert Sidney Johnston and saved by Don Carlos Buell. The capture of Vicksburg and the Battle of Chattanooga, which gave Grant a brilliant reputation at the North, were believed by the Confederates to be due more to the weakness of the forces opposed to him and the bad generalship of their commanders than to any great ability on Grant's part. That he was bold and aggressive, we all knew, but we believed that it was the boldness and aggressiveness that arise from the consciousness of strength, as he had generally managed to fight his battles with the advantage of largely superior numbers. That this policy of force would be pursued when he took command of Virginia, we had no doubt, but we were not prepared for the unparalleled stubbornness and tenacity with which he persisted in his attacks under the fearful losses which his army sustained at the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania. General Grant's method of conducting the campaign was frequently discussed among the Confederates, and the universal verdict was that he was no strategist and that he relied almost entirely upon the brute force of numbers for success. Such a policy is not characteristic of a high order of generalship and seldom wins unless the odds are overwhelmingly on the side of the assailant. It failed in this instance, as shown by the result at Cold Harbor, which necessitated an entire change in the plan of campaign. What a part, at least, of his own men thought about General Grant's methods was shown by the fact that many of the prisoners taken during the campaign complained bitterly of the useless butchery to which they were subjected, some going so far as to prophesy the destruction of their army. "He fights," was the pithy reply of President Lincoln to a deputation of influential politicians who urged his removal from the command of the army. These two words embody perfectly the Confederate idea of General Grant at that time. "He fights" is how Brigadier General Evander of the Army of Northern Virginia characterized the overall feeling of the folks that he was talking to in Lee's army about Grant and Grant's fighting abilities. Now, you have to assume, or at least I'm going to give Law some credit for expressing himself, have to assume honestly that he was characterizing Grant as this useless butcher. And of course, this is something that's handed down today. You students of the Civil War have heard it said so many times that Grant was a butcher, that he used his overwhelming number of men against the Confederates in attacks. Cold Harbor, of course, lost sites, and Cold Harbor is well known, where Grant later regretted having made the additional attacks. He should have stopped and learned his lesson after the initial failure. But Grant learned, and Grant eventually did win the day. So there you have it. The commentary of Brigadier General Evander M. Law of what the Confederate generals and other men in the Army of Northern Virginia thought of Grant when he became part of the Overland campaign in the Eastern Theater in the spring of 1864. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.